Hello all, it's CatFactsPW. So a couple of people on YouTube and Instagram have been asking me for a tutorial, so I figured I'd go ahead and do that. I use my MacBook Air and my Wacom Intuos Pen and Touch tablet. I use the old version like this one, except my pen has an eraser. I got mine on eBay for about $70, but there are definitely cheaper and smaller options available. The program I use is Adobe Photoshop Elements. I purchased this on Amazon as part of a discount. Unlike Creative Cloud, this was a one-time purchase, so I have Photoshop Element as long as this computer continues to work. I know that this is no longer the most common drawing software, but most other software have similar features, and I know for a fact that ibispaint will have some of the capabilities that I will talk about later. So I'm starting off with a rough sketch. So while I'm struggling to make these proportions work, let me give you another quick disclaimer. So I'm sure you already know, but there are a lot of ways to do art. Everyone will have to find a method that works best for them, so don't think that anything I say is a law that must be followed. I'm not the best artist in the world. I'm still learning and improving, just like everyone else. That being said, I've developed my own method over the past 6 years using the techniques that I find the most useful and shortcuts and software tricks that I have learned. Some of them may not be relevant to you, but others may prove helpful. So back to the tutorial. So here I am making my sketch. You can see I just scrapped my original idea and started over. Again, mistakes. I usually make my sketch just using the default hard round brush. I usually also make a separate layer from the rough outline of the body and from the finer details such as the hair or the clothing. This is the stage where you can really mess around with the proportions. You can see me use the selection tool, that rope looking thing, to select, resize, and reposition whatever I deem necessary. Once I am satisfied with my sketch, I group all of the sketch layers and reduce the opacity of the group and start line art. I'm still using the default brush. I am also very heavily relying on Command Z, which most of you know is the control for undo. So that's how line art works in my experience. Just draw a line like 20 times until you're finally satisfied with how it looks. I also like to make my line art in several layers. I try not to have lines that will intersect in a lot of places in the same layer, if that makes any sense. I think it's easier to erase if I don't have to worry about accidentally erasing the wrong line. Or you could just have a steadier hand and be better at line art. I don't know, one of the two. Also, I glossed over it earlier, but the layer grouping feature is a good way to organize your layers. I don't know if ibispaint has this feature, but it can be really helpful if you want to turn off a group of layers. For example, if you wanted to get your character out of the way for a bit to draw a detailed background and didn't want to hit the visibility of every single layer that character was on. Or if you were making like a character design sheet and had multiple outfits for the same character and you wanted them all in the same document, you can group all the layers together and then turn it on and off to look at the different designs. Grouping layers can also be helpful if your document has a lot of layers, like over 70, and you're having a hard time navigating. Back to the tutorial at hand. After I finished the line art, I turned off the sketch group completely and made a few new layers underneath. Make sure your color layers are underneath your line art layers. I usually make mine under the muted sketch just to be safe. Using the eyedropper tool, I pull colors directly from my reference. Then I use the paint bucket tool to fill in the colors. I put each color on a separate layer. If this drawing had had more colors that didn't touch each other, I might have combined them onto the same layer, but this drawing had few enough colors, so I just made each its own layer. I also labeled the ones that weren't obvious, so I don't mix them up. You could do this for each layer color, and in retrospect I probably should have for the sake of this tutorial, but I think you can tell which layers are the blue and the hair. Anywho, after each color has been paint bucketed in, make sure you go over each color with just your normal brush. The paint bucket tool in Photoshop is not perfect and leaves little white gaps in the pixels even if your tolerance is set pretty high. Once all your colors are smooth, you can go on to the next step. So this drawing had some color gradients, so I started off with drawing those in. I find it easier to do the gradient first and then the shading. So for both the hair clip and the shirt, I made a layer above the color layer and created a clipping mask. I applied the gradient using the airbrush tool. I only wanted the gradient on the sleeve, so I erased the overspray. Then I began shading, starting with the skin. For the skin, I chose a color slightly darker and more red than the original skin color. Then I start cell shading on a clipping mask above the skin color layer. So while I'm shading, let me explain clipping mask for a minute. So a clipping mask is a layer that is clipped to the one below. Basically, anything that you color will only show up on the layer it is clipped to. This is one of what I understand to be the two most common shading methods. The other way is to select the color using a selection wand or selection brush. Both methods accomplish the same goal and prevent overspray and make it easier to color inside the lines. They both work, but I prefer the clipping mask method. Not only is it faster, it is also more organized in my opinion. As you can see in my layer panel, the clip layer is nicely indented above its respective color. I used to use ibispaint, and I know that clipping masks can also be used in this software. On my device, I have an iPhone 6. It pops up as a little arrow that says clipping, located right between the camera icon and the opacity slider. Once I'm satisfied with my cell shading, I make a new layer above the original layer. This makes the second clipping mask below the cell shading layer. On this layer, I use the airbrush again, using the same color as my shading color to blush the skin and add a little bit more depth. Then I go back to my cell shading layer and apply a layer mask by clicking the layer mask icon, that little rectangle thing with a circle in it. Layer mask changes the opacity of the layer on the part that you draw on. It's basically an enhanced eraser. So I use my layer mask and the airbrush to soften the edges of some of my cell shading and add some reverse highlights. Then, because this is skin, I go ahead and blush using a slightly redder color. I personally recommend blushing with a darker, more vibrant red. I think that the blushing looks more natural than using just a super bright pink color or a really bright red. That being said, this is an anime character, so use whatever creative liberty you want. I typically blush the cheeks, nose, shoulders, elbows, wrists, knees, and the tips of the ears. I make a new clipping layer for this in case I don't like the shade or the placement and have to erase the whole thing like I did here. Then I make it one more clipping layer and add the shiny little anime highlights. I use the same method for each color. Cell shading with a layer mask, airbrush the darker color for blushing, and then adding highlights. So each color usually has 3 layers unless there are some sort of special effects like additional highlights, shading, or gradients. Speaking of gradients, here is how I handle shading those. Keep in mind that there are multiple ways to shade gradients. The method I used this time around was to keep the gradient color on a clipping mask and then make another clipping mask above it. I set my brush color to a light gray and then set the blending mode to linear burn. I messed around with a couple of different color and blending mode combinations until I found this one that I ended up being satisfied with. This method works the best if you want the gradient to be 2 specific colors. Another good way to make gradients is to have your already completed image of the shading and everything, and then airbrush your color of choice onto a clipping mask above all of your shading clipping masks. Then set the blending mode on this layer to either hue or color, depending on how you like the effect, and there you go, easy gradient. When you use this method, you may notice a color difference between the color that you applied and the color that it ended up being after the blending mode was changed. So this method works better for effects or one-time illustrations, or if you aren't super picky about exact colors. Blending modes are an incredibly helpful tool that you can use to enhance your art. I don't often use blending modes for things other than gradients or special effects, but I know that there are artists who incorporate them into almost every drawing. ibispaint also has a blending mode feature, and I think most other high-quality art software also have some blending mode capabilities. And I recommend that you just mess around with them. They can give you some absolutely gorgeous effects, like this background that I did about a year ago. You can see that the vivid light blending mode gives me this lovely color combo. So back to the original drawing, I continue shading using the aforementioned method until I get to the eyes. I have a very dramatic way of shading the eye whites. This is just my style. So I airbrush a dark gray around the middle of the sclera, and then I make a layer over that and add a hard white semicircle. When I shade the iris, I make the pupil and the shadow on separate layers with pure black. Then I create a layer mask for each of these layers, and I use the airbrush tool to add the highlights that I use. I add more details to the pupil in a lighter color in another clipping layer, and then I create a whole new layer all the way above the line art layer and add the shiny anime sparkles. Then I start the hair. I like to do the hair last. I don't know, I think the drawing just feels more satisfying if you do the hair last. usually because the hair is more detailed and intricate. I had a ton of fun shading this hair. I mean, look at that braid. I'm so proud of myself. I used the same method where I cel shaded with a layer mask and then had an airbrush for more subtle shadows. But I also highlight with an airbrush in a slightly lighter color on a second layer. I usually go crazy with the hair highlights. Look at all that sparkle. Something else I do in my style for over-exaggeration of the highlights, I make a new clipping mask just below the highlight layer and select a color that is even darker than my shading color, and then I airbrush this color underneath all of the highlights so that they really pop out. One final thing I like to do is add additional details, like little straight strands of hair. I draw this effect on the same layer I drew the eye shines, or a layer above that, and just add little strands of hair flowing in and out of the braid and the rest of the hair. I think it just adds a nice little professional touch. At this point, I'm done with the character, so I start to add other effects. One of the most common effects that I use is a soft glow around the character. So a quick and easy way to do this is, at least in this program, is to select all of your layers. I did this by selecting the topmost layer and then scrolling all the way down and then pressing the shift key while tapping on the lowest layer, and it just highlights every single layer. Once I have all of these layers selected, I press Command J that copies all the layers, and then Command E to merge all the layers. Now I have a layer with a duplicate of all my coloring, shading, and light art on one layer. So I drag this layer to the very bottom, and I make a solid color background to showcase my point a little bit more, and then get distracted trying to mess around with the layer mask. But anyways, once I have a background, I make a clipping mask over my duplicate character layer, and then solid fill the clipping mask. I used white in this case, but you can use any other color, or a gradient, or a rainbow, or a pattern, go crazy. Then select your duplicate character layer and select the filter tab. I did not record my screen properly, so I cut off the menu, but there are several drop-down menus to the right of the Files tab. One of them is titled Filter. Click on that one and then select Blur, and then choose Gaussian Blur from that drop-down menu. A little preview screen will pop up and allow you to adjust how intense you want the blur to be. It helps if you zoom in to see how you want the effect to look. It ended up not looking as intense as I wanted it, so I selected the two layers and hit Command J to copy them again. The Gaussian blur, as well as the other filter options, are features that are pretty exclusive to Photoshop as far as I understand. I have never worked with other drawing software such as Fire, Alpaca, or Clip Studio Paint, but I do know that ibispaint, or at least the free version, does not have this feature. There are a plethora of effects that you can create with filter modes and with layer masks, as you watch me fail to demonstrate that effect here. Layer masks are also not a feature of ibispaint as far as I can tell, but they are really integral to simplifying a lot of tasks if you know what you're doing with them. I might make a video just on the different applications of layer masks if anyone is even interested in that, but like, who am I kidding? I have like 73 subscribers. Did anyone even watch this far? Anywho, I ended up not liking how the layer mask looked in this instance, so I scrapped it and used another Photoshop feature that I love to mess around with, brush scatter and spacing. I chose the default white airbrush and then ramped up the scatter and spacing in the brush settings. This makes it easy to get the sparkle effect shown here. This is another feature that ibispaint does not have to my knowledge, but I believe a more extensive program might have some capabilities of this feature. So with that, I sign my name and I'm done. The final step is to export this photo as a PNG file. So with that, I've showed you step by step how I do essentially like all of my artwork. I basically make a lot of layers and use a lot of clipping masks and blending modes. If you're someone with Photoshop or a similarly complex art program, I encourage you to test out layer masks, filters, blurs, brush spacing, and copious amounts of layers. If you don't currently have one of these programs, I recommend doing research on free alternatives or learning the intricacies of your own program. Thank you for watching, and be a good potato.